What if I told you that the most powerful religious institution in medieval Europe was secretly controlled by creatures that shouldn't exist? What if the Vatican's greatest mysteries weren't about faith or politics, but about an ancient pact with the undead? What if every midnight mass, every papal decree, every holy war was orchestrated by beings who feared the very cross they claimed to serve? Welcome to Blood and Scripture, where ancient legends, forgotten horrors, and supernatural wars come to life. If you love exploring the untold side of mythology, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the bell below so you never miss another legendary story. Tonight, we're diving into one of history's most chilling conspiracies. Not the kind you'll find in dusty archives or declassified documents, but the kind that exists in the shadows between documented history and whispered legend. This is the story of how vampires didn't just survive the rise of Christianity, they infiltrated it, manipulated it, and turned the very institution meant to destroy them into their greatest weapon. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why certain papal tombs remain sealed, why some Vatican archives are forbidden even to the highest clergy, and why medieval chroniclers wrote of popes who cast no reflection in mirrors. But first, let me show you just how deep this conspiracy goes. Picture this. The year is 847 AD. Rome burns under the scorching summer sun, and Pope Leo IV stands atop the walls of the Vatican, watching as Saracen raiders pillage the eternal city. But here's what the history books won't tell you. As the flames dance across his pale features, witnesses swear they see no shadow cast by the Holy Father's form. The papal guards whisper among themselves, crossing themselves not in prayer, but in protection against their own pontiff. This wasn't an isolated incident. For over 6 centuries, from the darkest depths of the medieval period through the height of papal power, vampires didn't just influence the church, they became the church. They turned holy water into a weapon of control, transformed communion wine into something far more sinister, and used the fear of damnation to hide their own unholy nature. But how could creatures of darkness possibly infiltrate an institution built on light? How did beings who should flee from crosses end up wearing them? The answer lies in understanding something most vampire hunters never realized. The undead weren't destroyed by Christianity's rise. They evolved with it. You see, vampires had always been masters of adaptation. In ancient Rome, they posed as senators and merchants. In barbarian tribes, they became shamans and war chiefs. But when Constantine legalized Christianity and the church began its march to absolute power, the most cunning vampires recognized an unprecedented opportunity. Why hide in shadows when you could command from the throne of St. Peter itself? The first vampire pope wasn't some dramatic conversion or violent takeover. It was a masterclass in patient infiltration that took generations to complete. It began in the catacombs beneath Rome, where early Christians buried their dead, and vampires found their perfect hunting ground. But instead of simply feeding, these ancient predators studied. They learned the rituals, memorized the prayers, and most importantly, they discovered that Christian blood, blessed and sanctified, provided a more potent sustenance than any they'd ever tasted. By the 4th century, vampire acolytes were rising through the ranks of the clergy. They excelled at midnight vigils, never seemed to age, and possessed an otherworldly charisma that drew both followers and victims. Their pale complexion was attributed to holy fasting, their aversion to daylight explained as devotion to nocturnal prayer, and their need for blood disguised as the sacred mystery of communion. The breakthrough came during the reign of Pope Stephen VI in 896 AD. Stephen was already known for his erratic behavior, including the infamous cadaver synod where he put his predecessor's corpse on trial. But what historians missed was the real reason behind his obsession with the dead. Stephen had been turned just months after his papal coronation, and his newfound hunger drove him to acts of increasing desperation. The transformation of Stephen marked the beginning of what vampire historians secretly call the Sanguine Dynasty. Over the next 3 centuries, vampires would occupy the papal throne more often than mortals, creating a shadow hierarchy that manipulated Christian doctrine to serve their own dark purposes. Consider Pope Benedict IX, who supposedly sold the papacy 3 times between 1032 and 1048. The official story claims greed motivated his actions, but the truth is far more sinister. Benedict was a fledgling vampire, barely a century old, who lacked the experience to maintain the careful facade required for long-term papal rule. Each time he sold his position, it was actually older, more powerful vampires removing him from power and installing a more suitable candidate. These vampire popes didn't rule alone. They created an entire infrastructure of undead clergy, from cardinals who could walk into any royal court without invitation, to bishops who used their authority to establish feeding territories across Europe. Monasteries became recruitment centers where promising young men would mysteriously vanish during their novitiate, only to return months later as pale, devoted servants of their new masters. The genius of their system lay in how perfectly vampire nature aligned with ecclesiastical power. The church already demanded celibacy, explaining why these clergy never aged or bore children. Religious authority gave them access to every home, as no Christian would deny entry to a man of God, and the ritual of communion provided the perfect cover for their true sacrament. But perhaps most brilliantly, they weaponized the very symbols meant to destroy them. Holy water became a tool of control, with vampire clergy claiming it burned only the truly wicked. This allowed them to identify potential threats while maintaining their facade of holiness. Crosses weren't obstacles, but badges of office, and the more ornate and prominent the crucifix, the more it proclaimed the wearer's supposed sanctity. The Crusades represent the pinnacle of vampire manipulation of Christian institutions. What mainstream history presents as religious fervor was actually the largest feeding operation in vampire history. Pope Urban II, who called for the First Crusade in 1095, had been turned during a pilgrimage to Jerusalem decades earlier. His famous speech at the Council of Clermont wasn't divinely inspired. It was the calculated move of a predator who had learned to hunt on a continental scale. Think about it. The Crusades sent millions of young, healthy Christians to foreign lands where they would die far from home, with their deaths blamed on infidels rather than investigated too closely. Vampire knights and clergy, embedded within crusading armies, had an unlimited supply of victims, all while appearing as holy warriors fighting for God. The blood spilled in the name of Christianity during this period fed vampire dynasties for centuries. The evidence was always there for those who knew how to look. Crusader accounts speak of commanders who fought tirelessly through the night but never appeared on battlefields during daylight hours. They describe religious leaders who could inspire men to suicidal charges with nothing more than a whispered word, their voices carrying an otherworldly compulsion that no mortal throat could produce. Medieval chroniclers, writing years after events, often noted strange details about these holy wars. Knights who returned from campaigns appeared decades younger than when they left. Priests who blessed armies before battle were seen drinking from chalices that contained something far darker than wine. And in the aftermath of major victories, witnesses reported seeing flocks of bats emerging from Christian camps just before dawn. The vampire popes didn't limit their manipulation to military campaigns. They systematically altered church doctrine to serve their needs. The concept of transubstantiation, where bread and wine literally become the body and blood of Christ, wasn't theological evolution. It was vampire theology, designed to normalize and sanctify the consumption of human blood within Christian ritual. Confession became an intelligence network, with vampire priests using the seal of the confessional to gather information about potential threats, identify families with strong bloodlines suitable for turning, and locate individuals whose disappearance wouldn't be immediately noticed. The promise of absolution gave these predators access to humanity's deepest secrets and greatest vulnerabilities. Even the architecture of medieval churches served vampire purposes. The prevalence of crypts and underground chambers provided perfect resting places for undead clergy. Tall, narrow windows kept interiors dim during daylight hours, while elaborate ceremonies filled with incense and candlelight created an atmosphere where pale complexions and unusual behaviors could be attributed to holy mysticism rather than supernatural hunger. The most chilling aspect of this conspiracy was how completely it succeeded. For over 3 centuries, vampires guided Christian policy, launched holy wars, and shaped the spiritual lives of millions. They turned humanity's greatest weapon against the darkness into darkness's greatest weapon against humanity. And they did it all while their victims knelt before them in prayer, begging for salvation from the very beings who sought to damn them. But this level of control couldn't last forever. Even the most careful predators eventually make mistakes, and by the 13th century, cracks were beginning to show in the vampire conspiracy. Certain members of the clergy began to notice patterns, papal decrees that seemed to benefit the night more than the day, cardinals who aged backwards rather than forwards, and most troubling of all, communion wine that tasted metallic and left congregants feeling drained rather than blessed. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of both the church and the undead hierarchy that had claimed dominion over it. A battle between the faithful and the faithless, between those who served the light and those who had corrupted it. But that, my friends, is where our story truly begins to get interesting. The first cracks in the vampire conspiracy appeared not in Rome, but in the monasteries of France, where a young monk named Brother Thomas of Aquinas began documenting disturbing patterns in papal correspondence. Thomas wasn't hunting vampires. He was simply a meticulous record keeper who noticed that certain papal bulls were issued exclusively during winter months, that some cardinals' handwriting had remained unchanged for decades, and most troubling of all, that several high-ranking clergy members appeared in illuminated manuscripts dating back over a century, looking exactly the same. But Thomas's observations might have remained buried in dusty archives if not for a chance encounter in 1243. While copying texts in the scriptorium, he witnessed Cardinal Benedetto Dianani consuming what appeared to be fresh blood from a communion chalice during private prayers. When confronted, the cardinal's eyes flashed with an inhuman fury, and Thomas felt his will dissolving under that terrible gaze. Only the intervention of dawn streaming through the monastery windows saved the young monk from a fate worse than death. Thomas fled to the safety of daylight, but his mind raced with the implications. If a cardinal could be one of these creatures, how high did this corruption reach? His investigation began cautiously, examining papal portraits for telltale signs. No reflections in ceremonial mirrors, shadows that seemed disconnected from their owners, complexions that remained unmarked by age despite decades of documented service. The breakthrough came when Thomas gained access to the Vatican's restricted archives during Pope Innocent IV's reign. Hidden among theological treatises and administrative records, he discovered a series of coded letters between various bishops, written in Latin, but using substitution ciphers that replaced certain words. Communion became feeding. Congregation became herd. Salvation became conversion. The implications were staggering. These weren't isolated incidents of corruption. This was a coordinated conspiracy spanning multiple papal reigns, with vampire clergy maintaining detailed records of their activities, their territories, and most chillingly, their breeding programs. They had been systematically identifying bloodlines with particular spiritual sensitivity, tracking families across generations, and orchestrating the transformation of the most promising candidates into their ranks. Brother Thomas's investigation revealed that the vampire hierarchy had created an entire shadow church structure. For every mortal bishop, there was an undead overseer. For every human cardinal, a vampire handler who guided policy from the darkness. The papal throne itself had become nothing more than a puppet seat, with the true power resting in the hands of creatures who had traded their souls for eternal unlife centuries ago. But Thomas's greatest discovery was a document that changed everything he thought he knew about the relationship between vampires and Christianity. Hidden in a lead-lined vault beneath St. Peter's Basilica, he found what appeared to be the original covenant between the first vampire pope and his undead council. The parchment, written in what appeared to be a mixture of Latin and blood, outlined a plan that went far beyond simple infiltration. The vampires hadn't just corrupted the church. They had been systematically rewriting Christian doctrine to serve their ultimate goal. Every major theological development of the past 3 centuries had been carefully orchestrated to make humanity more susceptible to vampire influence. The emphasis on submission to clerical authority, the doctrine of papal infallibility, the expansion of confession to include the most intimate details of believers' lives. All of it designed to create a population of spiritually dependent sheep, ready for harvest. The document revealed that the vampire conspiracy had even influenced the timing of major Christian holidays, Christmas celebrations that kept families indoors during the longest nights of the year, Easter vigils that required believers to gather in darkened churches, All Souls' Day, when the boundary between life and death was supposedly thinnest. These weren't ancient traditions. They were feeding schedules, carefully designed to provide vampire clergy with optimal hunting opportunities. Thomas realized he was holding evidence of the greatest deception in human history. But as he prepared to flee the Vatican with the documents, he discovered he wasn't alone in his investigation. A network of mortal clergy had been quietly gathering evidence for decades, passing information through coded sermons and hidden messages in illuminated manuscripts. They called themselves the Illuminated Brotherhood, and their leader was none other than Pope Innocent IV himself. The revelation that a mortal pope had not only survived but actively worked to expose the vampire conspiracy sent shockwaves through Thomas's understanding of church politics. Innocent wasn't just another puppet. He was a resistance leader who had spent years carefully maneuvering vampire cardinals into positions where they could be identified and eliminated. The Inquisition, which history remembers as a tool of religious oppression, was actually Innocent's weapon against supernatural infiltration. The vampire hierarchy's response was swift and brutal. Cardinal Dianani, the same creature Thomas had witnessed feeding, orchestrated a series of accidents that eliminated key members of the Illuminated Brotherhood. Monasteries burned under mysterious circumstances. Priests who asked too many questions died in their sleep. And Brother Thomas himself found his life under constant threat from shadows that moved independently of their owners. But the vampire conspiracy faced a problem they hadn't anticipated. Their centuries of infiltration had created a generation of mortal clergy who were genuinely devoted to their faith, not just their undead masters. These believers began to notice the contradictions between vampire-influenced doctrine and the true message of Christianity. They started asking dangerous questions. Why did certain cardinals never appear during daylight ceremonies? Why did communion wine sometimes taste of iron and leave communicants feeling weakened? Why did the church's greatest treasures include so many mirrors that reflected empty spaces where high-ranking clergy should appear? The tension between the vampire hierarchy and their mortal pawns reached a breaking point during the Christmas Mass of 1252. Pope Innocent IV had carefully orchestrated the ceremony to take place entirely during daylight hours, with every window in St. Peter's Basilica thrown open to let in the Roman sun. As the vampire cardinals made increasingly desperate excuses to avoid the service, their true nature became undeniable to the assembled clergy. What happened next would be remembered as the Christmas Purge, though official church records describe it merely as a reorganization of the College of Cardinals. In a single day, over 24 high-ranking vampire clergy were exposed and destroyed, their ashes scattered in consecrated ground to prevent any possibility of resurrection. Pope Innocent had used their own arrogance against them, exploiting their assumption that no mortal would dare challenge their authority. But the vampire conspiracy was far too entrenched to be eliminated by a single bold stroke. For every undead cardinal exposed in Rome, 3 more operated in shadows across Europe. The network of vampire clergy had spent centuries creating redundancies and fail-safes, monasteries that served as safe houses for fleeing undead, bishop seats that automatically passed to vampire successors, and most troubling of all, an entire generation of human clergy who had been psychically conditioned to serve vampire interests without ever realizing their true master's nature. The survivors of the Christmas Purge retreated deeper into the shadows, abandoning their direct control of the papacy, but maintaining influence through carefully placed agents and long-term manipulation. They had learned that overt control attracted unwanted attention. Their new strategy would be far more subtle, working through human intermediaries who genuinely believed they were serving God, while actually advancing a vampire agenda. This shift marked the beginning of what vampire historians call the Shadow Century, a period when undead influence over the church became nearly impossible to detect because it operated through layers of human proxies. Vampire masters no longer wore cardinals' robes. Instead, they whispered instructions to ambitious bishops, manipulated papal elections through seemingly mortal political maneuvering, and used their supernatural charisma to influence church policy from behind carefully constructed facades of pious mortality. The genius of this new approach was its invisibility. When vampire cardinals had walked openly through Vatican halls, their pale complexions and unusual behaviors eventually attracted notice. But vampire influence operating through charmed human agents appeared completely normal. A bishop's sudden change in policy could be attributed to political pressure or divine inspiration. A cardinal's inexplicable knowledge of events happening hundreds of miles away could be explained as exceptional intelligence networks. The supernatural became indistinguishable from the natural, making detection nearly impossible. The Shadow Century also introduced a new breed of vampire operative, creatures who had been turned specifically for infiltration purposes rather than simple survival. These weren't ancient vampires adapting to Christian institutions, but carefully selected mortals who had been transformed after demonstrating exceptional talent for religious manipulation. They retained their human memories, their understanding of mortal psychology, and most importantly, their ability to genuinely inspire faith, even while serving darkness. Brother Marcus of Toledo exemplified this new generation of vampire infiltrators. Turned in 1267, after displaying remarkable skill at converting heretics back to Orthodox Christianity, Marcus maintained his passionate devotion to what he believed was the true faith. The vampire who transformed him had been careful to leave his religious convictions intact, merely redirecting them toward a version of Christianity that served undead interests. Marcus genuinely believed he was doing God's work, even as he systematically identified and eliminated threats to vampire influence. This psychological conditioning created the perfect double agent. Marcus could pass any test of faith because his faith was real, simply misdirected. He could inspire genuine religious fervor in others because he felt it himself. And he could detect deception in mortals because he had no conscious awareness of his own duplicity. The vampire hierarchy had weaponized sincerity itself, creating servants who were more convincing than any conscious actor could ever be. The effectiveness of this approach became clear during the papal election of 1271. For nearly 3 years, the College of Cardinals had been deadlocked, unable to choose a successor to Pope Clement IV. Vampire interests demanded a candidate who would reverse many of Innocent IV's anti-supernatural policies. But any obvious manipulation would attract the attention of surviving members of the Illuminated Brotherhood. Enter Cardinal Teodaldo Visconti, a seemingly perfect compromise candidate who had spent years working as a crusader in the Holy Land. His selection appeared to result from exhausted cardinals finally settling on an outsider who hadn't been involved in Roman political machinations. What they didn't realize was that Teodaldo had been carefully prepared for this moment during his time in Jerusalem, where vampire crusaders had spent months conditioning his responses to key theological questions. Pope Gregory X, as Teodaldo became known, proved to be everything the vampire hierarchy had hoped for. His reforms seemed designed to strengthen church unity and combat heresy, but their real purpose was to create new opportunities for supernatural infiltration. The Second Council of Lyon, which Gregory convened in 1274, established protocols that made it easier for vampire clergy to operate across national boundaries, while appearing to strengthen papal authority. Gregory's most significant contribution to the vampire cause was his systematization of the Inquisition. While the popular understanding presents the Inquisition as a tool of religious oppression, vampire strategists recognized it as the perfect weapon for eliminating supernatural threats. By giving inquisitors broad authority to investigate unusual behaviors and unexplained phenomena, Gregory created a mechanism that could identify and eliminate rival supernatural entities while protecting vampire interests. The brilliant deception lay in the Inquisition's public mission versus its secret function. Officially, inquisitors sought heretics, witches, and enemies of the faith. In practice, vampire-controlled inquisitors used their authority to eliminate werewolf packs that threatened vampire-feeding territories, destroy magical practitioners who might recognize undead infiltration, and silence mortal investigators who asked too many questions about church leadership. Consider the case of the Cathars, the heretical sect that flourished in southern France during the 13th century. Official church records describe them as dangerous heretics who rejected Catholic doctrine and threatened Christian unity. But vampire archives tell a different story. The Cathars had discovered evidence of supernatural infiltration in the church hierarchy and were preparing to present their findings to secular authorities. The Albigensian Crusade, launched against the Cathars in 1209, wasn't primarily about theological differences. It was a preemptive strike designed to eliminate a mortal population that had grown dangerously knowledgeable about vampire activities. The systematic slaughter of Cathar communities served a dual purpose: removing a direct threat to vampire secrecy, while providing massive feeding opportunities for undead crusaders. The phrase, "kill them all, God will recognize his own," attributed to papal legate Arnaud Amalric during the massacre at Béziers, takes on a chilling new meaning when viewed through this lens. It wasn't religious fanaticism driving the slaughter, but calculated elimination of witnesses who might expose the greatest conspiracy in human history. By the late 13th century, vampire influence over the Inquisition had become so complete that many inquisitors were themselves undead, using their authority to create elaborate feeding operations disguised as religious investigations. The infamous torture chambers weren't primarily designed to extract confessions of heresy, but to slowly drain victims' blood while maintaining plausible deniability about their deaths. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, represented the pinnacle of vampire manipulation of religious authority. Tomás de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor, had been turned decades before his appointment. His fanatical devotion to Catholic orthodoxy, carefully preserved and redirected towards serving undead interests. Under his leadership, the Inquisition became a state-sanctioned feeding operation that eliminated thousands of potential threats while appearing to strengthen Christian unity. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of vampire manipulation during this period was their influence over theological education. Vampire scholars embedded within universities and seminaries systematically altered the curriculum to produce clergy who would be more susceptible to supernatural influence. They emphasized submission to authority over critical thinking, promoted interpretations of scripture that supported vampire interests. And most importantly, eliminated or discredited any theological works that contained accurate information about supernatural threats. The University of Paris, which trained many of Europe's most influential theologians, became a particular focus of vampire infiltration. Professor Guillaume d'Auvergne, who held the chair of theology from 1228 to 1249, was secretly turned during his tenure and used his position to influence an entire generation of church scholars. His teachings on the nature of good and evil subtly redefined concepts in ways that made vampire predation appear as divine judgment rather than supernatural parasitism. Students trained under vampire-influenced professors carried these corrupted teachings throughout Europe, establishing a theological framework that normalized many aspects of vampire behavior. The emphasis on mortification of the flesh made pale, sickly appearances seem holy rather than suspicious. The doctrine of predestination suggested that some humans were naturally meant to serve others, justifying vampire dominance over mortal populations. And the concept of spiritual warfare was redefined to focus on abstract evil rather than the very real, supernatural threats that walked among the faithful. This educational infiltration created what vampire strategists called the compliant generation. Clergy who had been trained from their earlier studies to accept and even celebrate conditions that made vampire predation easier. These weren't conscious collaborators, but genuinely devout priests and bishops whose understanding of Christianity had been subtly twisted to serve undead interests. The psychological sophistication of this long-term manipulation cannot be overstated. Vampire masterminds had spent centuries studying human psychology, religious motivation, and social dynamics. They understood that the most effective control came not from force or obvious deception, but from shaping the very foundations of how their subjects understood reality. By the dawn of the 14th century, vampire influence over the church had evolved far beyond the crude infiltration tactics of earlier centuries. They had created a self-perpetuating system where each generation of clergy was more susceptible to supernatural manipulation than the last. The conspiracy had become so deeply embedded in church structures that even many vampires involved in it had forgotten the original scope of their infiltration. But this very success contained the seeds of the conspiracy's ultimate vulnerability. The more completely vampires integrated themselves into church hierarchy, the more dependent they became on maintaining that institution's power and credibility. They had tied their fate so completely to Christianity's dominance that any threat to the church became an existential threat to their own survival. And threats to church authority were growing. The rise of secular kingdoms with power to rival papal influence, the emergence of merchant classes who valued practical results over spiritual authority. Most dangerous of all, the slow spread of literacy that allowed ordinary people to read scripture for themselves rather than accepting clerical interpretation without question. The vampire conspiracy that had once seemed invincible now faced challenges that their centuries of planning hadn't anticipated. Their greatest triumph, the complete infiltration of medieval Christianity, was about to become their greatest liability. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether the undead would maintain their grip on human civilization or face exposure that could lead to their final destruction. The first signs of the conspiracy's unraveling appeared in the most unlikely of places: the papal kitchens of Avignon. During the Church's exile from Rome in 1309, Pope Clement V had established his court in the French city, believing distance from Italian politics would strengthen papal authority. What he didn't realize was that he had also separated the vampire hierarchy from their carefully established power base, forcing them to operate in unfamiliar territory where their influence was far less secure. Brother Jean de Moily, a simple kitchen monk responsible for preparing the papal meals, began to notice disturbing patterns in the Holy Father's dietary requirements. Pope Clement claimed to be fasting for spiritual purification, yet his private chambers required daily deliveries of what appeared to be sacramental wine in quantities that would kill an ordinary man. More troubling still, the chalices returned empty each morning, but the papal apartments reeked of iron and decay rather than fermented grapes. John's suspicions deepened when he discovered that several cardinals had requested their meals be served exclusively after sunset, claiming their devotions required them to maintain nocturnal schedules. These same prelates never appeared in the papal gardens during daylight hours, despite Clement's enthusiastic promotion of outdoor prayer as a form of spiritual discipline. When Jean attempted to deliver a forgotten breviary to Cardinal Bertrand de Goth's chambers one afternoon, he found the rooms completely empty, despite explicit instructions that His Eminence was engaged in private meditation. The kitchen monk's investigation might have ended there, dismissed as the overactive imagination of a simple servant, but fate intervened in the form of a kitchen fire that spread to the papal archives. While helping to salvage precious documents, Jean discovered a collection of letters that had been hidden behind false walls in the archive chambers. These weren't official papal correspondence, but private communications between various cardinals, written in a cipher that replaced standard Latin ecclesiastical terms with something far more sinister. The letters revealed that Pope Clement's court wasn't just corrupted by vampire influence. It was a carefully orchestrated relocation designed to establish vampire dominance over the French Church while maintaining the illusion of papal independence. The move to Avignon hadn't been a political exile. It had been a strategic expansion, allowing vampire cardinals to operate beyond the scrutiny of Roman observers, while extending their influence into territories that had previously resisted supernatural infiltration. Jean learned that the vampire hierarchy had been planning this relocation for decades, carefully maneuvering church politics to create conditions that would make the move appear necessary while concealing their true motives. The conflict with King Philip the Fair of France over papal authority wasn't a genuine political dispute. It was theater, designed to justify establishing a papal court that would be more amenable to vampire control. But the most shocking revelation in the hidden correspondence was the scope of the vampire expansion plans. Avignon was merely the first phase of a continental strategy that aimed to place vampire-controlled papal courts in every major European capital. The ultimate goal was to fragment the Church's central authority while maintaining vampire influence over each regional hierarchy, creating a network of supernatural puppet states masquerading as religious institutions. The correspondence also revealed the existence of something called the Crimson Conclave, a secret assembly of the most powerful vampire lords who had been manipulating church politics for centuries. These weren't merely turned clergy who had adapted to ecclesiastical life, but ancient creatures who had been orchestrating Christian development since the religion's earliest days. Names appeared in the letters that dated back to the Roman Empire, suggesting some of these vampires had been manipulating religious institutions for over a millennium. Cardinal Bertrand de Got, who had been instrumental in Clement's election and the subsequent move to Avignon, was revealed to be a creation of the Crimson Conclave, turned specifically to facilitate their expansion into France. His apparent political acumen and diplomatic skill weren't natural talents, but supernatural charisma, enhanced by centuries of undead experience channeled through carefully selected human intermediaries. Jean's discovery of this correspondence coincided with increasingly obvious signs that something was fundamentally wrong with the papal court. Servants began reporting that certain cardinals cast no shadows during the brief moments when sunlight penetrated the palace corridors. The papal physician noted that several high-ranking prelates showed no signs of aging, despite years of documented service, their complexions remaining unnaturally pale and unblemished. Most disturbing of all, the local population of Avignon had begun to suffer from a mysterious wasting illness that seemed to spread through proximity to the papal palace. Citizens who attended papal audiences returned home feeling drained and listless, often developing a peculiar anemia that resisted all medical treatment. The city's physicians were baffled by symptoms that included an aversion to sunlight, an inexplicable craving for raw meat, and in the most severe cases, an aggressive hostility toward religious symbols. The vampire hierarchy's response to these growing suspicions revealed both their desperation and their overconfidence. Rather than retreating or adjusting their tactics, they doubled down on their infiltration efforts, believing they could overwhelm any opposition through sheer supernatural force. Cardinal de Got orchestrated the appointment of additional vampire prelates to key positions within the papal bureaucracy, creating a concentration of undead influence that made concealment increasingly difficult. This escalation proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The University of Paris, which had been partially infiltrated by vampire scholars for decades, still retained enough independent thinkers to recognize the patterns emerging from Avignon. Professor Giles of Rome, a genuine mortal who had somehow avoided vampire conditioning, began correlating reports of the papal court's unusual behaviors with similar incidents documented throughout church history. Giles's investigation led him to Brother Thomas of Aquinas's hidden archives, which had been preserved by a secret network of mortal clergy who called themselves the Order of the Dawn. These weren't the illuminated brotherhood that had operated during Innocent IV's reign, but a new generation of vampire hunters who had learned from their predecessors' mistakes. Instead of attempting direct confrontation, the Order of the Dawn focused on documentation, slowly building an irrefutable case against supernatural infiltration. The Order's strategy was brilliantly patient. They recognized that vampire influence had become so deeply embedded in church structures that any dramatic revelation would be dismissed as heretical madness. Instead, they worked to create conditions where the vampire hierarchy would expose themselves through their own actions, using their supernatural arrogance against them. Brother Chandemaille became a crucial asset in this strategy. His position in the papal kitchens gave him access to information about the daily routines of suspected vampire clergy, while his humble status made him essentially invisible to creatures accustomed to commanding absolute authority. Jean began documenting every anomaly he observed, creating detailed records that would eventually form the foundation of the Order's case against the Avignon papacy. The turning point came during the Feast of the Epiphany in the 1314, when Pope Clement announced a special midnight mass to be held in the Cathedral of Avignon. The ceremony was intended to demonstrate the papal court's spiritual devotion, while providing cover for a massive feeding operation that would drain the life force from the assembled congregation. What the vampire hierarchy didn't realize was that the Order of the Dawn had been preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity. Brother Jean had discovered the true purpose of the midnight mass through intercepted correspondence between vampire cardinals, and he had shared this intelligence with Professor Giles and the Order's other mortal members. Working together, they devised a plan that would force the vampire hierarchy to reveal their true nature before hundreds of witnesses, creating undeniable evidence that even the most skeptical observers couldn't dismiss. The plan required extraordinary courage from ordinary mortals who understood they were facing creatures of immense supernatural power. But the Order of the Dawn had learned from centuries of vampire manipulation that the undead's greatest weakness wasn't holy water or wooden stakes, but their own pride and overconfidence. They had grown so accustomed to operating without opposition that they had forgotten how to respond to genuinely clever resistance. As the midnight mass approached, both sides prepared for a confrontation that would determine the future of the church and potentially expose the greatest conspiracy in human history. The vampire hierarchy believed they were orchestrating another triumph of supernatural manipulation over human faith. The Order of the Dawn knew they were fighting for the soul of Christianity itself. The Cathedral of Avignon had never seen such an elaborate ceremony. Every candle in the city seemed to have been gathered for the occasion, creating a flickering sea of light that danced across the ancient stone walls. Pope Clement, resplendent in ceremonial robes that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the candlelight, took his position at the altar, while vampire cardinals arranged themselves throughout the nave with predatory precision. But hidden among the genuine worshippers were members of the Order of the Dawn, each carrying carefully concealed mirrors that had been blessed by mortal priests who remained untainted by vampire influence. Their plan was audacious in its simplicity. At the moment of consecration, when all attention would be focused on the altar, they would reveal their mirrors and force the vampire hierarchy to confront reflections that would expose their true nature to the assembled congregation. What happened next would be remembered as the miracle of Avignon by those who witnessed it, though church records would later describe it in terms that obscured the supernatural truth. As Pope Clement raised the communion chalice, dozens of mirrors suddenly appeared throughout the cathedral, held by worshippers who had seemingly been overcome by religious fervor. The effect was immediate and devastating. Where the mirrors should have reflected the Holy Father and his cardinals, they showed only empty robes suspended in midair, ceremonial vestments moving as if worn by invisible figures. The congregation's gasps of shock turned to screams of terror as they realized they were witnessing something that defied every natural law they understood. But the vampire hierarchy's response revealed just how completely they had been trapped by their own success. Rather than attempting to flee or minimize the exposure, they reacted with the supernatural fury of predators who had been denied their prey. Cardinal de Goth's human facade crumbled entirely, revealing the ancient creature beneath as he snarled at the assembled mortals with fangs that gleamed in the candlelight. the transformation of the other vampire clergy followed with horrifying inevitability. Centuries of careful disguise evaporated in moments as the undead hierarchy revealed their true forms to a congregation that had come seeking spiritual salvation. The midnight mass became a scene from humanity's darkest nightmares as creatures of legend stalked through the cathedral aisles, their supernatural speed and strength making escape impossible for most of the terrified worshippers. Yet the Order of the Dawn had anticipated this reaction. Hidden throughout the cathedral were additional mortal agents carrying supplies that vampire infiltrators had taught them to fear. Genuine holy water that hadn't been corrupted by undead influence. Wooden stakes carved from trees that had never grown in shadow. And most importantly, mirrors backed with silver that had been blessed by priests whose faith remained pure. The battle that followed wasn't the elegant supernatural duel that centuries of vampire manipulation had conditioned mortals to expect. It was desperate, brutal, and chaotic, with ordinary believers suddenly finding themselves armed with weapons they barely understood against enemies they had never imagined existed. But their faith, genuine and uncorrupted by vampire conditioning, proved to be a more powerful weapon than any of the traditional vampire hunting tools. Pope Clement himself felt to Brother Jean de Mailly, the simple kitchen monk whose humble service had concealed a courage that centuries of supernatural manipulation couldn't corrupt. As the Holy Father advanced with inhuman speed toward a group of terrified children, John stepped between them with nothing but a wooden cross carved from the monastery's olive trees. The contact between blessed wood and vampire flesh created an explosion of light that reduced the papal impostor to ash in seconds. The destruction of the vampire pope sent shockwaves through the undead hierarchy that extended far beyond the cathedral walls. Vampire lords throughout Europe felt the psychic scream as one of their most powerful members was obliterated, alerting them that their carefully constructed conspiracy had finally been exposed. The age of shadows that had dominated medieval Christianity was coming to an abrupt and violent end, but victory came at an almost unbearable cost. Of the nearly 300 worshippers who had attended the midnight mass, fewer than 50 survived to tell their tale. The cathedral itself was left a burned-out shell, the ancient stones cracked and blackened by supernatural forces that had been unleashed during the confrontation. Most tragic of all, many of the Order of the Dawn's members had sacrificed their lives to ensure that evidence of vampire infiltration would survive to warn future generations. The immediate aftermath of the Avignon Revelation, as it came to be known among those who understood its true significance, created a crisis that threatened to destroy the church entirely. How could an institution claim divine authority when its highest officials had been revealed as literal demons? How could centuries of papal decrees maintain their validity when they had been issued by creatures whose very existence was an affront to Christian doctrine? The survival of Christianity itself depended on the actions taken in the days following the cathedral battle. Cardinal Jacques Duez, one of the few high-ranking prelates who had somehow avoided vampire influence, found himself thrust into leadership of a church that was simultaneously vindicated and utterly compromised. His first act was to authorize the complete investigation of every ecclesiastical appointment made during the previous century, a process that would reveal the true scope of vampire infiltration. The investigation's findings were staggering. Nearly 40% of Europe's bishops showed clear signs of supernatural influence, either through direct transformation or psychological conditioning. Entire monastic orders had been compromised, their members turned into unwitting agents of creatures they believed were serving God. Most shocking of all, the corruption extended into the highest levels of secular government, with vampire clergy having influenced royal courts and noble houses throughout the continent. Yet, even as the truth emerged, the vampire hierarchy was already adapting to their exposure. The ancient creatures who had survived the Avignon revelation understood that their age of direct control was ending, but they weren't prepared to abandon centuries of careful work. Instead, they began implementing contingency plans that had been developed over generations of strategic thinking. Rather than attempting to maintain their positions within the church, the surviving vampire lords began a systematic withdrawal from ecclesiastical institutions. But this wasn't a retreat. It was a strategic repositioning that would allow them to maintain influence through new channels while avoiding the kind of direct scrutiny that had led to their exposure in Avignon. The vampire conspiracy that had dominated medieval Christianity for over 6 centuries was finally broken, but its legacy would haunt the church for generations to come. The creatures who had worn papal crowns and cardinals' rings retreated into the shadows they had once commanded, their ancient hunger unsatisfied, but their methods forever changed. They had learned that direct control invited exposure, that even the most perfect disguise could be shattered by simple mirrors and genuine faith. Yet, as we close this investigation into history's darkest conspiracy, remember that predators, this cunning, this patient, this adaptable, don't simply vanish when one strategy fails. They evolve, they wait, they find new institutions to infiltrate, new authorities to corrupt, new ways to feed on humanity's trust. The next time you wonder why certain leaders seem to cast no shadow in photographs, why some institutions operate exclusively in darkness, or why those in power sometimes seem to drain the very life from those they claim to serve,